Well, welcome everyone. I'm so thrilled and excited to see you and welcome you to this wonderful event with our esteemed speakers. Um, Welcome to the House of Dates. It's wonderful to share the space with you this afternoon and to be in conversation with our speakers. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Pourfarzaneh. I'm an assistant professor of Islamic and digital media studies at Starr King School for the Ministry. I also direct the Center for Multireligious Studies, and I'm just going to offer a few words about our work before we begin today's event. Many of us have grown into settings where religious identity and formation are of a binary nature, where Christian or Muslim, Buddhist or Hindu, Jewish or Baha'i, spiritual but not religious. Founded in 2021 and inspired by the legacy of our beloved former provost, Dr. Ibrahim Farajajeh, the Center for Multireligious Studies intends to nurture the study of non-binary multireligious identity, where all faiths and spiritualities are welcome as equal partners in educating to counter oppressions and creating just and sustainable communities. House of Dates is an ongoing series presented by the Center in partnership with Muslim and Jewish voices from diverse backgrounds and histories. The series offers opportunities for deep learning, multi-religious worship, and chaplaincy training, demonstrating a commitment by Jews, Muslims, and allies to counter Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and advocate for peace and justice in Palestine and Israel. You can visit our website at sksm.edu/houseofdates to learn more and sign up for future events. Our next event will be with Sufi poet and devotional artist Sukina Noor, entitled Soul Care for the Sacred Activist. That will be on Friday, March the 8th, 12 p.m. Pacific time. I'm just really grateful to see each one of you and grateful to our honored speakers and my honored colleague and fellow faculty member at the Center for Multireligious Studies, Taya Shere, and I'm going to turn it over to her now.
Thank you so much, Sam, and welcome to each of you here. It's a gift to be gathering at this incredibly tender and intense time to be in a conversation that feels so ripe and almost painfully ripe, and also really meaningful and needed. And I'm grateful to be in the exploration of spiritual leadership in times of crisis with two of my beloved friends and colleagues who are guiding in such important, needed, and meaningful ways at this time. We're here today with Omid Safi, who is a Sufi teacher, a professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern studies at Duke University, a columnist for On Being, and a leading Muslim public intellectual, appearing often on news outlets including PBS, BBC, and CNN. Omid guides journeys in Turkey, Morocco, and beyond, and offers online courses open to spiritual seekers of all backgrounds. He has a podcast called Sufi Heart, and his books include Memories of Muhammad and Radical Love, teachings from the Islamic mystical tradition. And we have the honor and delight of being here too with Hadar Cohen, an Arab Jewish scholar, mystic, and artist who teaches direct experience of God and Jewish mysticism at her spiritual skill building school, Malchut. Hadar is a 10th generation Jerusalemite with lineage roots also in Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Hadar weaves the spiritual with the political through performance art, writing, music, and ritual. Her podcast, Hadar's Web, features community conversations on spirituality, healing, justice, and art. Hadar, Omid, welcome. It's an honor and gift to be with you. Thank you for taking the time amidst all that you're up to be here with us this day. I'll dive in with a question, and I'll invite you, Omid, to begin, and then we'll turn to Hadar. What is guiding your spiritual leadership at this particular time? You're each leading in potent and creative ways, and from my perspective, as I'm watching, are um, responding to emergent needs with grace, wisdom, and clarity of voice and vision. And I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about how you are finding your way and what is guiding your spiritual leadership. Also, what that means to you, and maybe share for folks who may not know, if it wasn't captured in my bio, what your spiritual leadership looks like at this time of crisis. Omid, feel so welcome.
Thank you so much, dear and beloved Taya. Thank you, Hadar. What a joy and honor to be with both of you and to be with the friends who have taken time to for us to be together. Um, I feel that many of us have benefited from drinking deep from waters that have flown in many different rivers. We've known them by different names. Here we might call it the Atlantic, and there call it the Pacific, though of course all the oceans are connected. And it's that same way, I think, when it comes to the life of the spirit. I know for me, my roots, or as we say here in the South, my roots, are deep in the Islamic tradition, and in particular the Sufi tradition. Um, but I would be a fool to not also drink deeply and benefit from the depth of the prophetic Jewish tradition, from the Black-led freedom movement, the prophetic dimension of Christianity, Buddhism, and what have you. And these days, what is a lot in my heart and at the forefront of my moral and spiritual imagination is this very short definition that Rabbi Heschel offers. And for me, he is the North Star of the Jewish faith, and really actually of the prophetic tradition. And one of his definitions of what it is to be a participant in a prophetic movement is to be a person who keeps God and humanity together in every breath for all moments. That we will never speak about God without also speaking about humanity, never speak about humanity without speaking about God, and to do so by centering the lives of the people who at the moment find themselves poor, oppressed, refugee, needy, orphan, widow. Um, I think all of us who see the vast scale of human suffering around the world, be it the Sudan or Congo or Yemen or Pakistan, Kashmir, Myanmar, and certainly Palestine and Israel, we all can have a conversation that is rooted and grounded in the facts of history, of politics, of context, and that's important. But it's not just a political crisis. I think for me, what the task of I'm not always comfortable with these terms like leadership, because a lot of people claim it. And in my tradition, if you love the folk, you serve the folk. And if you want to serve the folk, you better love the folk. You better feed the folk. You better shelter the folk. I see lots of leaders who just, it seems to be a hoarding context for themselves and their posse, as opposed to any work of real love and real service. But if we're going to use that term, I think part of what that work of loving and serving and leading at times and following at times looks like is a reminder that the present moment is not just a political crisis, not just an ecological crisis, not just a humanitarian crisis. It is an absolute, unmitigated moral, religious, and spiritual crisis. And if what is happening in Gaza, and not just in Gaza, also in West Bank, also with the potential to spill over to the whole region, if it doesn't fundamentally shake your standing with God, if the cries of the 30,000 people who have been killed and 2 million people who have been made homeless. We're told in my tradition that the cries of the oppressed reach all the way up to the throne of God and shake it to its absolute foundation. If the suffering that's coming out of Palestine and Israel can shake the throne of God, but it has not moved us into direct and informed and compassionate action, then it means not only that we're on the wrong side of history, it means that we're on the wrong side of God. I think that's where I find myself.
Thank you so much for what you're sharing here. Hadar, feel welcome. So curious if you'll speak into what it means for you to be inside of spiritual leadership in a time of crisis and in this time of crisis.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you so much, Taya, for hosting us and inviting us. And thank you, Omid, for this beautiful words that I resonate with very much. Yeah, there's a lot for me to say. And I just want to emphasize, Omid, what you were saying of the spiritual crisis that we are in. Because for me, in my view, suffering, pain, acts of violence, systemic oppression, these are all ways when we are separated from God. These things run rampant when we do not have access to God. And it is, this cycle, and it perpetuates itself. And for me, so much of my work is, well, how do we find this exit route from a vicious cycle? You could call it a trauma cycle, you could call it a cycle of systemic oppression. But there's some way of like looping that I find that can happen. And I believe that when we poke a hole and allow for the light of God to come in, that to me is actually justice work. To me, there's no separation really from the spiritual work and the justice work. They're interconnected. And, I think that in terms of what my spiritual leadership looks like these days, it's working a lot with people, whether it's one-on-one or in communities or writing. But really what I want to say is that it's also prayer. And it's also this level of, I think sometimes there's kind of this sense of like, oh, the spiritual leader has it figured out and then they're bringing something to the people. But I think for me, this moment has been very much about, we're actually all in this together. The level of loss, the level of grief, the level of pain is just so intense and so unbearable. And I don't think there's anyone on this planet that has it together, whatever that may mean, because we've been shaken. We've been so shaken. Right? And some people are still kind of holding on to the denial aspects, but there's still a shaking, right? Because that's what happens when we are witnessing this level of human suffering. And I think that how I've always understood the spiritual traditions is that it's really about learning how to see God in the here and the now, and whatever is present. And sometimes I find that, especially in the Western world, we have these ideas of what it might look like to be spiritual, of having a happy life, of being stable, of being grounded, of having this thing. And there's a lot of image that's associated with it. And to me, this moment is breaking a lot of images. And true spirituality is actually in the depth that we have cultivated in our hearts to be with suffering, whether that's our own suffering or with other people's suffering, and with the suffering of the world, right? Because God is actually in there too. And God is crying for us to see that. I think that there's a human tendency that when we see pain and suffering, we shut down, or we avoid, or we deny, we turn away. And when we turn away from that, we're actually turning away from God as well. Another way of saying that we're turning away from ourselves, right? Because God is embedded in the self as well. So to me, the spiritual leadership for now is really about encouraging all of us to build capacity of what it looks like to turn towards the pain. And now that means a lot of different things, right? Sometimes it means opening the heart. Sometimes it means reaching out with a helping hand to someone who's in great suffering. And it also means the action part, right? Because that's not separate. You know, this world, there's a teaching in Judaism, a midrash interpretation of when God created Adam, and God takes Adam for a walk in the Garden of Eden and says to Adam, look at all these beautiful trees and look at all this beautiful world that I'm gifting to you. Now I want you to take note, because if you destroy it, there's not going to be anyone who will come to fix it. It actually will be on you. And I find that to be incredibly true for the now as well, right? There's no external source that will make any of this go away. It's actually on all of us to take responsibility, to act, and to shift the course of where we are, so that we don't repeat these cycles of suffering. And I will say that, just on a personal note, you know, with witnessing the ongoing genocide in Gaza, there's something as a Jewish person that just feels so incredibly painful, because it feels like we've been here before. We've been here in the 1930s and 1940s in Europe, right? And all of this energy that actually never fully got integrated into the world, but just got transferred onto another people. That's a big part of my work, is the trauma research around how Jewish trauma has been transferred onto Palestinians. So to just witness how that happens, there's something incredibly painful there. And I think that there's also something that is inviting me and all of us to actually remember that we do have spiritual power, that we don't just inherit cycles of trauma and violence, but we actually are also active co-creators, active respondents, that we actually can create a different reality. And that's not something in the future, that's something that can actually happen in the here and now.
Thank you so much, Hadar. Omid, I'll invite you to chime in here if you wish.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hadar. I so not just resonate, as the cool kids say. I feel what you're saying deep, deep in my bones, deep in my heart. And that here and now, I think that is really where all the mystical traditions go to live. And it's the only place that we can breathe, is in this here and now. And I think what I find so enchanting and powerful is that reminder that we have these twin works to do. There's that work of healing, there's that work of dealing with our own individual suffering and illumination, and not to bypass the pain, not to bypass the suffering, to have those cracks where the light can get in, to not settle for this capitalistic delusion of buying happiness, signing up for more and more and more commodified crap, that at the end of which, once we have signed up for enough courses and podcasts and brownie points on Instagram, then somehow happiness will greet us. No, what if it's all mingled together? What if it's all love and heartache and joy and sadness wrapped up and woven around each other. And so there's that work that all of us have to do, can do, should do. And I loved, and I took a note here, that it's not just that we inherit cycles of trauma, that our ancestors didn't just mess us up for good, they also loved into us. They also gave us wisdom, and they gave us light, and they gave us beauty, and they loved us when they didn't know our names. And then there's also an aspect of it which is communal, and it has to take place not just in our own heart, but in relationship with our fellow human beings, in communities, in neighborhoods, face to face, and then not settling for the neighborly. If you don't love your neighbor, you got a lot of work to do, but the challenge for us is to move beyond that, to love the stranger. And that notion of linking together the individual and the global and the personal and the human, and even what we might think of as the non-human realm of being, I think that's the meeting ground of all of these spiritual traditions.
I so appreciate what you're each naming, and I want to ask in to this strand around being shaken, and how can we not be shaken in this moment, and if we're shaking but that doesn't move us to action, like what do we do to not get stuck there, and to make sure that we have in our shakenness the resource also to be showing up and not to be in freeze or in a place of feeling like at a loss to know what to do. And this connects, Hadar, to something that you said around building capacity for what it looks like to turn toward the pain. And as I hear Omid, you speaking, I hear you saying build capacity for being with the pain and also for being with the love as we're simultaneously with the pain. And I feel like you both model so well the capacity to hold the shaking and the action, the turning attention and bearing witness to the atrocity and the grief, and also to root in the wider love. And I'm wondering if you can speak to how you are able to hold those things and what you find supportive for folks in process of building capacity for learning to hold those things.
Okay, I'll start. Wow, thank you for that very, very powerful question. There's a lot in there, and I first just want to say that it's not easy or simple. And I think, for me, at least, it comes with a lot of wrestling between those two. And I think it also kind of comes into this question that, sometimes when we're in the trauma state, whatever that may mean, where we're in a freeze, we're in a rage, we're in a heartbreak, we're in, sometimes we feel like we need to fix it in order to feel like we can get into that wider lens of love, because it kind of goes back to what I was talking about. We have like the image of what it means. We have the image of what it means to be loving, and being loving means speaking a certain way, or, but to me, holding that wider lens of love, I don't actually need to do anything for it to be present, because it's God's nature. It's actually already here. So the whole modality of like when I'm in that trauma state and then there's a part of me that wants to try to fix it, that to me is actually a control pattern. And that is part of, I think, what is trying to die, right? Because in some ways you can look at all these systems of oppression as systems of control, which really come from the mind, right? Our own lack of ability to really be present fully, and I mean, we do this personally, but we also do this collectively. There's just so much levels of control. And to me, right, really rooting in love is the recognition. And this is, something that I feel like Omid, I love what you said in the beginning, that, right, that the space of multi-religiosity, right, that just because I'm coming from a particular tradition and religion does not mean that I have not also benefited tremendously from other religions. And I think that this is something that I value so much about Islam, in that teaching of surrender, in that teaching of the letting go. I find that to be not just powerful, but absolutely necessary, because otherwise you can't meet God. Something that I say a lot is that there's a story, a Jewish mystical story of a well-known rabbi who was going into a synagogue. He was going to visit this village, and the one person came and wanted to show him the synagogue, and he's like, hey, like, I'll come show you the synagogue for the afternoon prayer so you can pray. And he gets into the synagogue and he says, I'm so sorry, but I can't pray here. And the guy goes, well, what do you mean? And he's like, well, this synagogue is already so full and there's no space for my prayer. And the guy looks at him and he's like, what are you talking about? The space is empty. There's no one here. And he said, no, it's not full with people, but it's full with, all the ego that people were bringing into that spiritual space, all of those control mechanisms, all of those kind of misguided intentions, they fill up the space. So for me, I find that to be something so relevant. Is so often, right, we want God, we want love, we want justice, we want all these things that it seems like we don't have now. But we are not fully aware of the ways in which we are full with other things, that we actually don't have space to let in some of those other things. And I think that process of letting go and emptying and actually making space, right? In the political word, I will talk about that as the capacity for imagination, right? Just because something is the way that it is now does not mean that that's how it will be in the future. And holding on to that possibility of change is part of, right, holding on to space for transformation. So, I think that, kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier, of when we are in that trauma state, in that freeze, in that I don't know what to do, like, is there a way of opening up to that very experience and actually finding that that is love also, that it's not outside of it, right? Because this is the teaching that love is through everything. It's not like we need to fix and solve and adjust and become proper so then I can feel God, right? Like God is in everything that we can imagine. We just have to get our mental perceptions to not get in the way of that experience. And I will say, I think this is true for many people, and it's certainly true for me, that if I didn't engage with my own suffering and my own pain and my own processes that were keeping me bound, I don't know that I could have opened up to God, right? Because there's no way to open if you're not first bound. You can't recognize God if you don't, know the other version of it. So I think that letting go of what rooting in love is supposed to mean, and just remembering that it's actually already here, and surrendering into that God field.
Thank you so much, Hadar. Omid, feel welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Taya. Thank you, Hadar. In this kind of grappling between love and God and action, I think it's always helpful to remember that the opposite of love is not hatred, So much of the hatred that we see in this world, people know this from their own personal relationships. Sometimes that kind of hatred feels like the shadow of a love that used to be there and then is betrayed. But the very opposite, actual opposite, not just a shadow of love, is indifference, is that refusal to give a damn, that mocking of the child whose every loved one has been killed, the laughing and posting on social media videos as some depraved soldiers are blowing up not just buildings and houses, but homes. Homes. And there's a difference between a house and a home. A home is a house that made moist with love and with memory and with tenderness and with people who've made it into a home. So I think we're trying to get to that place of real love, a gritty, messy, grounded kind of love that rises certainly above hate, but also rises above indifference. And Hadar talked about the beautiful midrash, and from one of the same parts of the world that I know is so very dear to her heart, the great Ibn Arabi, probably the greatest mystic to have come out of Andalusia, of Spain, from the Islamic tradition. You know, he tells a narration, he traces it to the Prophet Muhammad, but of course you can also trace it to Jesus, almost as if these people are channeling the same light, in which in the Day of Judgment, Ibn Arabi is having an encounter with God, and God addresses the whole of humanity saying, "O children of Adam, I got sick and you didn't come to visit me." And people say, "Oh, you know, cherishing Lord, how can we come to visit you when you're God? And how does God get sick?" And God's response is, "Don't you know that my beloved servant, such and such, got sick, and none of you all went to visit him? If you had gone to visit him, you would have found me with him. O children of Adam, I was hungry and you didn't feed me." People are like, "You're God. How can God be hungry?" Well, you know, don't you know that my beloved servant such and such asked you for food and you didn't feed him? If you had fed him, you would have found me with them. I was thirsty. You didn't give me anything to drink. God, how can God be thirsty? You made water. Well, you know, my beloved devotee was thirsty and asked you for water, and you didn't give him anything to drink. If you had, you would have found me with them. And Ibn Arabi develops this whole, you could call it theology, but it's also way of relating to human beings. I am with them, that God is with the hurting, that God is with the suffering. And the concluding line of that narration from Ibn Arabi is God saying, "I am with the brokenhearted. I am with the brokenhearted." I think that's really the work of love, to realize that, yeah, on one hand, all of us carry a measure of brokenness, right? This is not some white savior complex, and it sure as hell is not some spiritual teacher savior complex that we're out there to save the broken. No, everybody has a measure of pain and suffering that we carry, and that our sufferings don't have to be equal. That the suffering of someone who 2 million people today who are being ethnically cleansed out of their home and are literally reduced to eating grass in a place where they've been bombed for almost 5 straight months, and 96% of their water is not safe for drinking. That suffering is not quite the same as my suffering when, if I get thirsty, I've got a glass of water that I just got out 5 minutes ago from the fridge. And I think I want to also just acknowledge that, we live, it's a Chinese blessing and a curse, may you live in interesting times. We live in a really interesting time. And the minute that you start talking about the suffering of some of God's children, some of which will and could and really should keep us up at night. And every time we think we've gone to the rock bottom and there's just no lower than the low, there's another story that comes, there's another image that comes. And, I think for me, these last few days, it was this little girl, Cedra, who's hanging from a window. And it takes you a while to figure out what's going on. And you realize it's because the bottom half of her body is shredded. Human beings don't look, it shouldn't look like that. And then to see what she used to look like earlier that day, like she's wearing the same sweatshirt just a few hours ago. That's the stuff of nightmares. And that's the stuff that, for me, I want to spend whatever breath I have, however little bit of energy that I have, and to say, how do we stop this? How do we stop? Because she is somebody's baby. Of course, her parents are killed, her uncles are killed, her siblings are like, it's the whole families that are being wiped out. And here's where that bizarre, depraved, interesting times in which we live is I'm watching on social media people posting her picture, not the shredded leg picture, like what she looked like 10 hours before, and saying, oh, for the sake of God, like, can we please stop this madness? And people are literally writing, what about Hamas? It's a 12-year-old girl. 12-year-old girls don't get to vote. She literally has nothing to do, whatever you think of Hamas. She literally had nothing to do. It would be like if somebody in this country loathed Trump and Biden and started opening fire on children. There's plenty of good reasons to loathe Trump and plenty of good reasons to have strong disagreements with what the president of this country is doing at the moment. But if you see children being slaughtered, not just 1 or 2 or 10 or 100 or 200, but 12,000, and you're like, for the sake of all that is holy and sacred, let us bond together to stop this. And people's response is, well, what about the God that Ibn Arabi knows, the God that Jesus knows, that the Jewish prophets knew? They didn't do what about. They did here and now. They did the suffering of the person right in front of them. This was one of the sentences that Rabbi Heschel has in that majestic 2-volume work of his, The Prophets, which of course Dr. King studied so carefully. And he describes that when the prophets are sent to Judea, some people came to them and they said, well, what about Babylon? If you think it's bad here, you should see what's happening in Babylon. And the prophets would roar back to them, I am not the prophet of Babylon. I am the prophet of here and now. Here and now. I've been sent right here. So I think that's part of the prophetic tradition, this loving tradition, that you love the folks so much that you cannot bear to be silent. You deal with the one who's suffering, you're witnessing. I think that's just where we are. When you see people suffer, you don't stop and ask, what party did you vote for? You don't ask, what's your genetic makeup? And can you prove that somehow 3,000 years ago, your ancestors, if you see a hungry child, you feed the child. If you see a child that's crying, you pick them up and you kiss them and you comfort them. And it's a strange sign of the age in which we live, in which a call for direct compassion for the people who are hurting is either bypassed or classified as, you name it, anti-Semitism or something else.
Thank you so much for what you're sharing here, Omid. And before I add one more question, I want to invite those who are tuning in, if you have questions for Omid and Hadar, feel welcome to place them in the chat, in the Q&A, so we can bring them here into the conversation. I hold such appreciation for the creative and deeply committed ways I see each of you, Hadar and Omid, showing up in ways that are, to me, seem to be emergent. Particularly, I'll speak to what I'll call your social media ministries, if that word works for you. I'm thinking of a video, Hadar, that you made at Hanukkah time that went very viral around lighting an extra, the Syrian tradition of lighting an extra candle and inviting folks to light an extra candle for Palestine. And I'm thinking, Omid, of your what is like this exquisite dance of posts between posting kind of beauty and thriving and creative heart images of Palestine and other things in the world with like the most stark and devastating images and like witness to what's happening. And I'm thinking, Hadar, of the conversations that you've been hosting, and both of you are weaving in ways that seem to me to be emergent and also are kind of on the cusp of, or kind of at an edge of, both sacred companioning and call to action. And I'm wondering how you, if that resonates with you as what you're doing, if you can speak to any aspect of what it's like to be in that dance and to be like fierce in the call to action while also being creative in how you're showing up and serving. And Hadar, I'll come to you first here.
Okay, thank you. That was really beautiful languaging. First of all, I love that, social media ministering. Maybe I will put that on my bio. Well, okay, so I want to say a couple of things. The first, that for me, spiritual practice has, I feel like there's this understanding that it has to come from the heart, because the mind actually does not have the capacity to understand God. It's not in its nature, right? The mind has its own nature and it's helpful for certain things, but it actually cannot understand God. So, this is a common trap that happens in the spiritual world, right? If people try to understand God through the mind and they're like, I can't, it doesn't make sense, right? So the mind will continue looping on that. And whatever you put in the mind, it will loop, right? So if you put fear, it will loop on the fear. If you put this story, it will loop on this. That's why it's like we kind of see the same repetitive stories, the same repetitive responses all of that, because it's actually a looping mechanism that's happening in the mind. And for me, part of finding God is remembering that, yeah, going into this phrase of God is in the here now, which is really another way of saying that God is alive, right? Meaning that if God is alive, I actually don't know who God is right now, because life keeps changing moment by moment. And what was true even 2 minutes ago is not true now anymore, because something has changed, even if it's a subtle shift. So there's a constant evolution of change that is happening. And to be with God is to be really attuned into that way of change. And that can only happen if I'm not allowing the mind to just loop on stories that will really loop on an infinite level, because that's what happens. And it really is a skill set of like learning to move from the mind to the heart, which, you know, is probably one of the most challenging paths for each of us to do. It seems so close, but yet so far. And one of the ways that I think about the heart, right? I mean, obviously the heart is a space of love and interconnection, but the muscle of the heart is actually courage. What makes the heart stronger is courage. You know, so often it's like we want greater love, we want, but then the fear comes and we shut down and we're too scared and we don't know, and then the heart can't grow. The heart grows when we meet fear and choose courage. That's when the heart becomes stronger, and it's like, you know, just like we go to the gym to strengthen our muscles, that's how you strengthen the heart muscle, is by meeting fear and choosing courage. So for me, that's been a huge part of my spiritual practice, is to find the things that scare me and learn how to do them, actually, despite the fear, meeting the fear and saying, actually, I want to choose a path of courage here. And I think that, you know, with the social media, with the conversation, with all these things, and with, I love that word, right, emergence, I think for me, it's been also this practice of courage, because all of these things are very scary to do. I do get scared sometimes before I put a post, before I do a thing. There's fear there. It's not that there isn't. And I think that it's so important. I mean, one teaching that I would just really, this is, I think, one of the key teachings for me in this moment, is what does it look like to actually practice courage? To feel fear, oh, I can't speak, or I can't say this thing, or I can't do this action, or I can't, you know, and to see that pattern and to say, actually, I want to strengthen my heart. And, you know, that's an invitation to everyone who's listening of like, what is one thing that you're scared of doing for in this time specifically, right? Whether it is to stand up for Palestine, or to stand up for Sudan or Congo or any of the other places that we were mentioning, but how do we actually practice courage? Because to me, that practice of courage is what allows for more love to come in.
Thank you so much, Hadar. Omid.
Yeah. Thank you, Taya and Hadar. I love this recentering of courage, because of course, you know, as you both know, the word courage comes from ko, which is the heart. Courage is a work of heart. And like almost anything else and everything else that is precious and beautiful, we have this weird way of twisting it. So we think that courage is to go bungee jumping, or courage is somehow only what, you know, a soldier does with, I don't know, sword, or I guess today would be machine gun, launching at the enemy. But a work of heart might just look a little different. It might actually be very invisible, very subtle. It's getting up in the middle of the night and taking care of your baby when you haven't had a good night's sleep. It's when you have two babies and one of them wakes up for morning prayers at 5 o'clock in the morning, and the other one stays up till way past night prayers. till 12:30 at night. Not that I'm speaking from any kind of a personal experience here of last night. Courage is synthetic. Courage links you to others. There's a limit to what the mind can comprehend, but the heart has the breath, and the breath is of Allah. I mean, that's why, again, to go back to Ibn Arabi, in one of his famous poems, my heart has become capable of every form. It's a pasture for gazelles and a convent for the monks, the temples of the idols, the Kaaba, and the scrolls of the Torah. The heart always wants to say, there's a better world than you and I, and it's that world of us. It's the world of we. It's that world of together. It's that world of what Rumi calls, you and I have to live as if you and I never heard of a you and an I. And again, to have the courage to name things. Between the river and the sea, you got more or less 7 million Arabs and 7 million Jews. What do you think we're going to do? Everybody loves this place. Everybody wants to live there. Really, the two options are either we figure out some way of sharing this land with dignity, with an insistence on respect and sharing and equality, or we're going to perish like fools. Or the alternative is permanent occupation, permanent humiliation, permanent ethnic cleansing, permanent disposition. Is there a better world that the heart has to offer more than me, myself, and I, and my people? Is there a greater we that we can imagine? And one of the lessons that we're learning, this is what one of my Palestinian friends has been teaching me, those closest to the pain are usually closest to the solution. We have so much to learn by people who have struggled and suffered the most. And I'm seeing this in some of the questions that our friends are already typing in about, I think Dan is asking the question that they're wondering, what do God and the prophets expect people to do while being genocided? What form of resistance? I'm aware of the fact that we don't all equally have the same heart reaction to the sufferings of different people. That for some, it might be to center the suffering of the Israeli hostages and the families of the hostages, and that rescuing 2 hostages is absolutely worth flattening a place that 2 million people have already been ethnically cleansed to. For somebody else, it might look like the little girl Hind, who was trapped in a car, and for 3 hours she kept screaming, asking someone to come and rescue her before the IDF soldiers shot and killed her. What is it that God and the prophets call us to? Let's look to see what those closest to the pain have to teach us. There's one of the images that I think many people have seen, maybe not everyone, but of that little beautiful girl, Reem, and his grandfather, the man with the multicolored turban. He's just holding her and he's just repeating to himself, Ruha Ruhi, right? This is the soul of my soul. She is the spirit of my spirit. And the hospital staff are like, okay, uncle, please put her down so we can wrap her. And he can't let go. He's kissing her cheek, he's kissing her eyes for that one last embrace. Ruha ruhi, yeah, she's the soul of my soul. And, you know, hundreds of millions of people have seen that footage. And if that grandfather named Khalid, if Khalid wanted to crawl in a corner and weep his eyes out and curse the people who did this till kingdom come, it would be absolutely understandable. That's not what he chose to do. He took the time to mourn, he took the time to weep, he still weeps. And now what he's doing is that he spends his days going from door to door, finding people whose legs have been amputated with no painkiller. There's no painkillers left in Gaza. And in the midst of the suffering and the physical and the emotional trauma of these amputees, he is touching their shoulders and telling them, you know, when you get to heaven, God's gonna have your leg waiting for you there. You're gonna have a reunion with your leg. You're gonna have a reunion with your child. You're gonna have a reunion with your husband. So what he's doing is that he's doing that Martin Buber thing, projecting the I into the thou. I see your pain, I see your suffering, and you're not alone. He's acknowledging his own pain, but he's doing that heart thing, that courage thing, that we're in this together. And it's these kind of people, and I'll just say, so that we're not just talking about beautiful girls and even that almost convenient number that people cite, women and children being slaughtered. Beautiful men, grown-up men who are showing the whole world a model of masculinity which is both tender and courageous, which is both rescue the child from the rubble and cry and sing and smile through your tears at the same time. They are our teachers. They are people that have an extraordinary amount to offer us without the need to valorize every single one of them and without the need to fetishize their suffering. But by God, there's a lot of spiritual teaching there for people who have hearts that are open to them.
Thank you so much for what you've each shared. I want to turn to Q&A, questions that have come in from folks who are tuning in today. And there are two questions that are almost connected, companion questions, one from Jessie and one from Farah. So I'll ask them both here. From Jessie, my feelings of urgency about these times on planet Earth often come through in my communication, leadership, and ministry. This can be alienating to people who haven't made space for their own grief and anxiety. Do you have any guidance for balancing the urgent need for action with this deep, slow gentleness to inspire collective movement in this moment? And then a parallel question from Farah. Thank you, dear Omid and Hadar. How do you contend with silent spiritual leaders, those who remain silent despite the suffering of humanity, despite the crisis in places around the globe, especially now in Gaza? Hadar, will come to you.
Hey, two good questions. Well, I'll start with the second one. You'll have to maybe remind me about the first one if I go on some detours. I think about the silence of spiritual teachers. I think if people are silent, then they're not really a spiritual teacher in this moment. And I really resonated with what Omid was saying about God being with the brokenhearted and God being with those who suffer. And I think, I mean, definitely if you are a serious learner of Judaism, but really I would say of every religion, that's just so crystal clear, that God is with those who suffer and those who are oppressed. So to me, it more speaks to the ways in which we've been deluded by what spiritual teachings are, and the ways in which, you know, we could talk about the systems of capitalism and how spirituality has been sold to people, when a lot of times it's just been co-opting ancient spiritual traditions and marketing them in ways that seem like they will liberate you from your own suffering, but actually just feed a system that is far, far from God. And I think that, you know, collectively, we do not have as much discernment as we need to have around what true spiritual teachings are. So for me, you know, going back to what we were saying earlier about this being a spiritual crisis, I actually think it's good if the spiritual teachers who are silent are silent, because it is revealing something about what the spiritual teachings actually are, and who's actually not equipped to be carrying the spiritual teachings right now. You know, if your response to this level of horror is not even to not, is to just not say anything, is to not engage, is to turn away, then you're also turning away from the spiritual teachings. And to me, that feels really clear. Now, I also want to say two other things that are perhaps not related to the question, but I'll detour. Well, first, you know, one of the things that I love about being Jewish, and one of the stories that we tell in Jewish communities about our own peoplehood and our own oppression, is that, you know, so many tried to kill us and we survived. That there's a resilience there, that somehow, even through massive threats of annihilation, they were not successful. Now, for me, part of what brings me faith in God, I would say faith in justice also in this moment, is this knowledge that even in the most extreme threats of annihilation of the Palestinian people, that it will not be successful. Just as it was not successful with the Jewish people, it cannot be successful because it actually doesn't have that power. And this is where my faith becomes very strongly rooted in God. Because if a system of mass militarization, capitalism, mass death, right, is successful, then that means that this is not God's world. And I know that that's not the world that I live in. And I know that all these things are actually tools of false powers. You can even call them golden calf. And I think that, you know, it's important to kind of, I mean, first remember that the will to live, that the life force, which to me is part of God, right? God is the alive nature of reality, which lives through all people, but lives especially strongly through people who are facing threats of annihilation, which right now are the Palestinian people. So that life force is going to continue emanating through them, and it's going to continue to get stronger. And to me, part of being a spiritual leader in this moment is to support that life force emanating through Palestinian people and permissioning that to grow and grow and grow. And I want to say that there's also something that about the cycles of pain and trauma, which I think I saw in some other questions as well. Because sometimes it feels like, well, it's like, well, how can humans be this vicious or be this cruel, right? Making these mocking videos, making these statements of a young girl whose body parts are been torn apart. And, you know, I think that this is where the political analysis, especially of Hannah Arendt, becomes really relevant here. And in some ways, we're actually not dealing with humans, we're dealing with a machine. And I think that distinction is important. And that is like the looping mechanism, right? I mean, when we're looking at what has been created through Zionism and through the Israeli state, it is a machine. It's a machine of militarization. It's a machine of imperialism. It's a machine of control. And it's just looping on itself. And it actually, because it's a machine, it cannot recognize the impact it has. It cannot register the level of devastation and the level of destruction. It doesn't have that ability because it's in machine status. And for me, part of the spiritual teaching is actually coming back to that heart. It is about protecting life. It's about protecting the life force. It's about noticing that we are living in extreme times where there is a robotic behavior, where people are just getting so kind of immersed into a certain level of thinking that is robotic, that is so disconnected from impact and from humans and from reality. So I would call it a spiritual resistance, is this insistence on protecting the life force and protecting the aliveness of it. And really like allowing the heart to remember itself and to not fall for the traps of the machine, and to notice who's stuck in those machine, and not necessarily, right, to like just stop seeing them as human in that moment, but to just recognize that there's so many beings who are being co-opted by this machine. And I think that clarity of that really helps to ground me and like, okay, well, what's happening and where am I and what's my role? I don't know if I answered the first question, but maybe I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Hadar, for what you shared. Omid.
Thank you. This thank you also for the wonderful questions that our friends had posted. Let me begin with the part about the silent spiritual teachers and leaders. I'll start by saying that I don't have the answer. I don't pretend to have the answer. And I do notice a certain inconsistency in my own reaction and responses, in the sense that when I'm home and I'm home with my wife, there's certain things that I say in my living room which look a little different than what I will post on social media. And in my living room, I echo Hadar. Somebody that hasn't had a damn thing to say about Gaza, I don't fundamentally see them as a spiritual teacher. This is a moral crisis for the world. And your words about healing and trauma and love and community ring hollow if you've been silent about one of the great moral issues of our time, in which we are absolutely 1,000% complicit. We are financially complicit. $300 billion of aid to Israel over the last few decades. We're complicit at the United Nations. We're complicit when President Biden issues a statement on the 100-day anniversary of this genocide and rightly names the suffering and the death of Israelis, and cannot even get his tongue and his mouth to move to say the word Palestine or Palestinian or Gaza, even though the sheer amount of the dead, the casualty, the suffering, the dispossessed is disproportionately on the Palestinian side. So in my living room, I might have certain choice words to say, and I'm a Southern boy, so it's going to be a colorful choice of language. Period, full stop. I also know that the teachings that give shape to my life tell me that we don't fully 100% know what other people are going through. I don't know. Is somebody silent because their life is a mess and they're going through a divorce and their community is falling apart? Maybe their loved one has cancer. I don't know. I want to always leave that room for God knows and I don't know. I also think that there's times in which, in this cancel culture moment that we find ourselves, to be able to do that really hard thing, which is, what my faith tradition calls suspect the lovely of people. Is it that they're trying to do their best and this is what their best has come up with, but they're really trying, but falling back on a kind of milquetoast, all lives matter nonsense without, of course, all lives do matter, all lives are sacred, but power and wealth and privilege and suffering are not symmetric. So how do we not sound like the anonymous Twitter boys who are like, why do we have a Black History Month in February? When is White History Month? And you're like, every freaking month is White History Month. How do we not sound like that? And who is the person with whom you can have a calling them in to a higher moral ground conversation? I don't feel necessarily inclined to name them, but one of the teachers who's had a lot of beautiful insights about vulnerability and trauma just posted both sides kind of statement, a lengthy both sides statement that reads like it was vetted by 27 lawyers, including some like nonsensical paragraph that you can imagine who insisted it has to be there about Iran. Like, WTF, like, what does Iran have to do with the death of 30,000 people? And if we're going to start naming countries, I can think of one blessed country in which she and I both live that has a lot more moral, political, financial, economic, institutional blood on its hand than Iran. So it's messy and it's complicated. And there's things that I give myself license to say in the privacy of my own living room or inventing to a few friends. But I do ask myself that question of what's my purpose in posting about this on social media? And here's the part that I want to be self-critical about, right? In the language of the Quran, always begin the critique with yourself, with your family, with your community, with your tradition, before you ever get to somebody else. Am I in a rush to post that critique because fundamentally I'm persuaded that their model of spirituality is incomplete and flawed and therefore damaging to people's soul? Okay. But am I doing it because of a kind of virtue signaling? And I'm saying, I want to have a best-selling book. And so why don't you all come and sign up for my online courses and my retreat and come on my program? And we are immersed in a capitalist culture. Capitalist culture permeates every single corner of our society, including the spiritual and religious and self-help spaces. The best that we can do is to fight, resist, and to struggle to find ways of coming up with alternate spaces and models. But let's not be naive about what a lot of the virtue signaling is also about, at least at a subconscious level. And I want to make sure that in trying to imagine into existence a model where love and justice, prayer and action are wrapped around each other, that the ego is not infiltrating that particular space. Yeah, maybe that's just a decent place as any to stop.
Thank you so much, Omid, for what you've shared here. We have an overflow of amazing questions in the chat and just a few minutes left. And so I'll ask a question for each of you to respond in brilliant brevity, if you will, which is for folks tuning in who are still feeling in to how to best show up in their own spiritual practice, in their own perhaps emergent spiritual leadership in their own communities right now, in a way that weaves, as you were just saying, Omid, love and justice, prayer and action as not separate from each other. And as you've both spoken to so beautifully earlier about like the vulnerability needed to lead at this time, like to bring our whole selves, to know that we're not perfect in it. What words of wisdom do you have for folks finding their courage, finding their voice, finding their ways and spaces of being at this time in a way that also may impact those in their community who are turning to them? Hadar, will come to you first.
Sure. Well, I think I would say that there's no one right way to do any of this, right? And I think this kind of goes back to this whole, and I, I get fixated on this too, because sometimes there's like an image of what it's supposed to look like or what I'm supposed to do, but there's no one who's kind of and I've definitely wrestled with this in my own spiritual path, is like looking to another model that I can just walk that path to. But I think that this moment is actually inviting all of us to kind of carve our own path. And I think that this is one of the most empowering views of true spirituality, which is that God is actually in all of us. So, I can tell you what's my way or what I have found that works for me, and maybe that's supportive. But I think the most supportive thing is to find the channel of God within you directly. And that can look different ways, right? And whether it's like listening to a more intuitive voice inside of you, trusting yourself, finding what moves your heart and following that. But I really just believe that it has to start from the inner. You can't do something if you don't feel it from the inside, if you're not being pushed into that direction, because not only will it probably not succeed, but it just won't have that power, which is the power of God. I mean, I believe that divine power is incredibly powerful, and actually we don't have to invent it. It's here. We just have to align ourselves to allow it to flow through us. So where is that inner alignment to allow for God to work through you, right? Where's that space where you're particularly needed? And there's different questions to ask. One question is like, well, what's your identity? Where are you from? Who are the people that are around you, right? Not as a dogmatic, like then that means X, Y, Z, but just to start understanding what's your positionality? What's your levels of impact here? How can, and moving from there, right? Then feeling into the heart space. Well, it's like, well, do I want to speak? Do I want to publicly speak to other people? Do I want to write speeches? Do I want to, whatever it is, do I want to do one-on-ones? Do I want to actually not talk to anyone and be in deep contemplation and meditation and prayer? Do I want to be out in the protest? Do I want to be, so there's so many different avenues, but the strength of them is not what the action is, but actually where it's coming from the inside. And the action will be more powerful if there is a resonance from your inner being and the levels of depth that hits inside of you. So yeah, I think the path is to, and it's an ongoing path, and again, it changes for me moment to moment, right? Sometimes I'm like, okay, time for speaking more publicly. Other times it's like, well, it's time for more writing or whatever it is. But just learning how to follow that intuitive channel, that communion, to me, I call that also direct channel, direct experience, that inner listening, because you can trust it and it won't betray you, because it's you. It's you and higher self. It's right, God speaking through you. So developing a practice of finding that, and it might take some time, right? Because sometimes it's not so easily available because we have confusion and we have all sorts of things. But to find that, and then once you find it, is to dedicate yourself to it.
Thank you, Hadar. Once you find it, what there is to dedicate yourself to it. Omid.
Thank you. Um, I being somebody who's committed and devoted to love. Love is the path. I don't know of a better path. If I did, I would walk it. And there's a wonderful poem from Rumi where he says, I know you're tired. Come, this is the path. I know you're tired. Come, this is the path. And that speaks to my heart. And I think when I was a little younger, I thought, okay, so to walk the path of love means that anger or fury or kind of righteous indignation at injustice just indicates a lack of spiritual maturity. And then something very funny happened when I sat at the feet of civil rights leaders and ordinary Black women who said, oh, hell no. There is absolutely a place for anger because we're sick and tired of our babies being shot. And we're angry because we love our babies. That anger is actually linked to our love. And then, you dig a little deeper and you find Dr. King and others saying things like, even rioting is the language of the unheard. You hear Jimmy Baldwin saying things like, we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression, in denying my humanity and the right to exist. Then we got some conversations that we need to have. So learning to also recognize and befriend a kind of righteous anger, as long as it doesn't end up recentering one's own ego or one community's ego or one narrative. But I completely 1000% agree with Hadar. At the end of the day, there's always that inward impetus of love, which determines if something has barakah, if something has grace or not. Is it transformative or does it just get people worked up? And we also have teachings of the Prophet that say things like, when you are witnessing injustice, change it with your hands. If you can't change it with your hands, try to change it with your words. And if you can't change it with your words, then at least pray about it in your heart. And that's the weakest of the faith, right? So for a tradition that's built on love, built on the real work takes place in the heart, he actually flips it and say, no, when you see material injustice, you got to do something with your hands. You got to stop the injustice, right? And so, one of the questions Karina Marshall was asking, as a Jew, how do you center the pain of Palestinians, but also feel the pain of Israelis? How do you pray for the oppressor? The Prophet Muhammad says, come to the aid of your family, your siblings, whether they're the oppressor or the oppressed. And people say, well, we get how to help the oppressed. how do we help the oppressor? And the Prophet says, you help the oppressor by stopping them. You're actually aiding their spiritual life by stopping them. So for me, and this is again connecting with another one of the questions, how do you allow Zionism to have a loving and honorable death? I am not invested in Zionism having a loving and honorable death. If what is meant by Zionism is Jews having a connection to the Holy Land, mazel tov. That's not what it means today, and that's not what it has meant for generations. For generations, it has been mired in a form of colonialism enabled by Great Britain and now the United States as a direct form of supremacy, which is now enshrined in the laws of the State of Israel. So for me, centering the lives of the oppressed means I start with those who are hungry, who are thirsty, who are dispossessed, who are robbed of dignity and homes. I will never want supremacy to have a loving and honorable death. What I do is to name the promised land. And the promised land for me is clear. It's the same thing that many Palestinians have called for. One shared nation in which Arab, Christian, Jew, agnostic, atheist, male, female, gay, straight, rich, poor can have access to exactly and identically the same set of rights and privileges where the holy sites are protected. Right? And if somebody wants to argue against that, let them argue against a secular democracy, argue against equal rights. And if that notion frightens you, let's talk about that, honey. Let's talk about that fear and where does it come from so that some demented genocidal politician can't weaponize that fear against other people. That's where I think many of us are in acknowledging that there is fear and suffering everywhere. But we begin the work where the pain is the greatest. And today, that means Rafah. That means 2 million people squeezed into a few square miles, being bombed day and night, with no structural, institutional solution in sight. So this really is a time, bring your prayer, bring your action, bring your voice, bring your spiritual community, because the night is dark and it's filled with terrors. But we cannot abandon the arsenal of prayer and love and hope for all. The one thing to go back, and I'll end with this, what as Rabbi Heschel says, there's only one thing that is forbidden, and that's despair.
Thank you so much, Omid and Hadar, for what you've shared. Welcome, Psalm, to close us.
Thank you, Taya. Thank you so much, Hadar, Omid. Everyone that's listening and viewing this either live or later on YouTube, just my deep gratitude on behalf of the Center for Multireligious Studies, Starr King School for the Ministry, and also our partners that benefit from hearing your wisdom and your sharing and this very delicate and powerful reminder of the power that we have in our hands to do something to help. The time right now, it might feel hopeless, but we are not helpless. And I would feel remiss in not offering a call to action that wherever you are and whatever you do, take whatever step you can to help in this crisis. If you need some places to look, we have some links on the Starr King website, including Jewish Voice for Peace and also the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. Those are two excellent sources to go if you need just a first point of contact for how to help. And I also want to just say one word of gratitude to just those that have submitted questions and made themselves vulnerable to ask really deep, questing questions about their own spirituality and their spiritual needs. And we've learned a lot today about spiritual leadership from the two of you. I'm very grateful for your presence. And thank you also, Taya, for your wonderful convening and coordination. Perhaps we can move to you for a closing in prayer for everyone that's here.
Thank you so much, Psalm, and thank you again, Hadar and Omid, for the blessings that you've brought through your wisdom, your clarity, your vulnerability, and just an invitation to all to attune to prayer in whatever way is most aligned and true for you. In a moment where there are no words, we seek to find them. Just giving gratitude for our lives and for this weaving, and with prayer that the abundance we are in simply by gathering in this moment overflow to most touch the places that need, the peoples that are amidst devastation, whose lives are actively at risk right now in this moment, as Omid just said, most particularly in Rafah and in Gaza and beyond. Just turning our prayer to an end to violence, and a prayer that we each find our ways of being in right action at this time, and those who most need protection are held fully in protection from the powers that seek to harm. May our devotion of attention, this gathering, be a blessing in our lives to those tuning in and in this world toward collective liberation and immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Amen. Amen, inshallah. May it be so. Thank you to each of you.